All right, what's going on, you guys? Nick here with Nick Strength and Power. So it's been almost a week since the 2019 Mr. Olympia, and I wanted to give a full, in-depth review of the entire men's open class, not just the top five, not just the top six, not just the winner. I want to talk about what went wrong with guys like Rowley Winkler, Juan Morel, and of course, Cedric McMillan. And I want to go over all the placings as well. So first, let's take a look at these official scorecards. So obviously, you had Brandon Curry in first, William Bonac in second, Hadi Chupin in third, Dexter Jackson in fourth, Rowley Winkler in fifth, Steve Kuklo placing sixth. Cedric McMillan wound up taking seventh place here. In eighth place, you had Lucas Osladil. In ninth place, Akeem Williams. In 10th place, you had Patrick Moore. We just made a video about him yesterday. He is, in my opinion, the most improved or the most overlooked bodybuilder of this lineup. Very, very impressive. Luke Sando slipping to 11th. This was his first Olympia ever, but he was hoping for a much higher Olympia placing. We'll talk about him later as well. Jonathan De La Rosa in 12th. In 13th, you had Max Charles. In 14th, you had Juan Morel. And in 15th, you had Michael Lockett. And in last place, 16th, Mohammed Shaban. So first, I want to talk about Hadi Chupin because to me, of the entire men's open lineup, Hadi Chupin was the biggest surprise and the most standout competitor of everybody to me. I mean, nobody really had any idea how Hadi was going to do. There was a lot of hype about Hadi going into this Olympia. The fact that he was struggling to get a visa, he had qualified for the Olympia several years before, but was unable to come over to the States to compete. And then when he finally got his visa, it was like a big debacle whether or not he was going to compete in 212 or in Men's Open. And he made the decision, which a lot of people thought was controversial, to compete in Men's Open instead of 212, despite the fact he's a shorter bodybuilder and he's done very well in 212 as a shorter bodybuilder, even in competitions against the reigning Mr. Olympia at the time, Flex Lewis. But it turned out that Hadi made a very smart decision competing in the 2019 Men's Open lineup at the Olympia, placing top 3 at his first ever Olympia in Men's Open bodybuilding. Now, Hadi also went on to win this year's People's Choice Award, which was the voting system they have in place where the fans vote for basically their favorite bodybuilder at the Mr. Olympia, which I thought was also very cool for Hadi. So despite the fact that in the past he wasn't able to get over here, he was never able to compete at the Olympia, Hadi made an extremely impressive impression on that Olympia audience. Everyone in the audience was going crazy for Hadi Chupin. When they announced the decision that Hadi was in third, everyone went crazy. People were not happy with that decision, and I think rightfully so. You know, the really impressive thing about Hadi to me, obviously he's got a ton of muscle packed onto that frame, but the conditioning that Hadi brings is something that I think a lot of people like to see on that Olympia stage. You know, I think a lot of these guys that you see on this list placing, you know, in the latter half of the top 10 and outside of the top 10, the reason why they placed that way was because they came in off or lack of conditioning, which I think was the case with Rowley Winkler, and we'll get to that later. But Hadi was known for and has been known for not only bringing a crazy amount of size, but also bringing a crazy level of conditioning almost every single time you see Hadi compete. And I believe that was the case here at the 2019 Mr. Olympia. And I think that's the reason why he cracked that top 3. And I think he certainly deserved to be top 3. But honestly, I think a very, very strong case can be made for Hadi Chupin actually beating William Bonac and taking second place. You know, I think the audience felt that way. Personally, after prejudging, I had Hadi in second for sure. I think it's a very, very good comparison, him and William Bonac. They're both shorter guys with a ton of muscle packed onto their frames. But as far as conditioning went, I thought that Hadi had the edge over William Bonac. I thought they had very, very similar physiques, just the way they're shorter and have all that size packed on. But I thought Hadi brought just a more polished and more conditioned package than William Bonac did. And personally, I had Hadi in second place, but that's not how it shook out. But I still think top 3 is a very, very tremendous finish for Hadi Chupin here. I do not think this is the end of Hadi Chupin. I think we're going to see a lot from him in the future. And keep in mind, he could make the decision to go back to 212, and he could go win the 212 Olympia next year. And of course, that's assuming that the 212 Olympia is even still around next year. But the bottom line for me is even though we had a lot of big names missing this year, no Sean Roden, no Phil Heath, no Big Ramy, Hadi Chupin was one of the biggest names, I think, in terms of making an impressive statement He was a huge talking point going into the Olympia, and he really delivered on all that hype. Oftentimes in bodybuilding, we get guys with a ton of hype behind them, and they end up not placing, where everyone thought they were going to place, and they end up being kind of disappointing. Hadi Choopan had a lot of hype behind him. I think he placed even higher than most people expected him to place and looked even better than most people expected him to look. So shout out to Hadi. He looked phenomenal here. And like I said, he made a really lasting impression, I think, on the bodybuilding world this past weekend at the 2019 Mr. Olympia. All right, so next up, I think a lot of people want to hear me talk about my opinion on Rowley Winkler. Pretty much every single person that came through my booth at the Olympia, I asked them all the same question. Who do you have winning the Men's Open Olympia? And almost every single person said either Brandon Curry or Rowley Winkler. If you watched a bunch of prediction videos on YouTube leading up to the Olympia, pretty much everybody was saying either Brandon Curry or Rowley Winkler. Rowley Winkler was not even in that top 3 this year. He was in the top 3 at last year's Mr. Olympia, right up there next to Phil Heath and Sean Roden. Many people even making the argument that Rowley could have beaten Phil Heath last year. And this year, Rowley ended up dropping down to 5th place. Now, this is no disrespect to any of the competitors, but I think most people would agree this was one of the lesser competitive years at the Mr. Olympia. It's hard to say that this was an extremely difficult lineup when you're missing the returning Olympia champion, the Olympia champion before that, and the runner-up and Big Ramy. I mean, the fact is, Phil Heath, Sean Roden, and Big Ramy were probably the 3 biggest names in bodybuilding this year, aside from Rowley Winkler or Brandon Curry, and they were all not there. So no disrespect to the competitors, but I do think this was one of the least competitive Mr. Olympias in the past few years. So for Rowley to drop to 5th in this lineup, I think was really an indicator that he was not in shape. And the primary thing that stuck out to me with Rowley is, you see those videos of Rowley at the Magic Mirror in Oxygen Gym in Kuwait. He looks phenomenal. He looks vascular. He looks freaky. He looks huge under that lighting in that mirror. His most muscular pose is insane. And I say this quite literally almost every single year at the Olympia. We see these crazy videos of Rowley leading up to the Olympia, and he doesn't look like that on stage. And that was the case this past weekend. I think, Rowley looked flat. His conditioning was off. I think he almost looked... he looked a little bit better than he looked at the Arnold Classic, but he looked pretty bad, in my opinion, at the Arnold Classic in Columbus, Ohio. And I just don't think he looked sharp enough here. He wasn't full enough here. Overall, to me, his conditioning was off and he looked flat, I think, is the reason for him placing 5th. Rowley just was not on at this year's Olympian. I think it's as simple as that. That's why he dropped down to 5th. I didn't really notice any crazy distension in the midsection, anything weird like that, like a bubble gut. It mostly just seemed to me that his conditioning was off and he appeared flat. Now, let's talk about Cedric McMillan taking 7th here. So I did an interview with Sean Roden at the Olympia Expo and asked Sean for his Olympia predictions. And Sean said, in his opinion, the most dangerous guy in that lineup is Cedric McMillan. Based on structure, posing, and just overall completeness, he said if Cedric is able to nail his conditioning, Cedric would be his favorite to win. Now, Cedric didn't nail his conditioning. He didn't look horrible, but he just obviously was not on. And this is typically, this is what we see quite often from Cedric, is he looks phenomenal when he does a show like the Arnold Classic. Cedric looks like a world beater at a show like the Arnold, but it just seems to miss the mark for whatever reason at the Olympia. Now, this year, I'll give him a little bit more credit because of the fact that he did receive a special invitation, so it is probably likely that at a certain point, when he realized he wasn't qualified anymore on points, maybe he didn't continue prepping as hard as he would have. Maybe he got off track a little bit. Maybe he thought he wasn't going to be able to do the Olympia. Whatever delay in response, the Olympia people gave him, before they accepted his request for a special invitation, that could have messed with Cedric's prep. He might not have been 110% in like he usually would be. Honestly, I think the special invitation could serve as a pretty good excuse, for why Cedric looked the way he did. Cedric is getting older, and he might not have that many more years to be in the conversation of winning the Olympia or top 3 at the Olympia. So I think if ever there was a year for Cedric to really, step up to the plate, hit it out of the park, and win the Olympia, it probably would have been this year. Now, granted, we still don't know what's going to happen in the future. I mean, we don't know that Sean Roden is ever going to be allowed back. We don't know what's going to happen with that case. We don't know what's going to happen with the Olympic promoters. We don't know what's going to happen with AMI. We don't know if Sean will ever be allowed back on the Olympia stage, or even if he is allowed, if Sean will even choose to go back to the Olympia stage. So we might not have Sean in that lineup again. We also don't know if Phil Heath is going to retire from bodybuilding. We don't know if Phil is going to come back. Phil hasn't taken a year off from the Olympia since he started winning. This was the first year that Phil has ever taken off during his Olympia reign. So, we don't know that Phil's going to come back. So the Olympia title next year could be, again, quote unquote, up for grabs. Now, Brandon Curry, I think, is a fantastic champion. I think the judges made the right decision in picking Brandon. I think he's a phenomenal bodybuilder. But the fact of the matter is he's not a Phil Heath. Phil Heath had the Olympia title locked down for 7 years to a point where people thought no one was ever going to beat Phil. And while I think Brandon's a fantastic bodybuilder, Phil Heath is kind of on another level. He's kind of on another planet, really. And it's hard for someone to lock down the Olympia title in the way that Phil Heath did. So I think if Big Ramy were to come back next year, Sean Roden were to come back next year, those are guys that would really give Brandon a run for his money and have given Brandon a run for his money in the past. And I don't really mean that as a negative on Brandon at all. I'm just saying I don't think the Olympia title is as locked down as it was for the past 7 years. So I don't think that Cedric's opportunity to win the Olympia is gone. I think there's still a very competitive opportunity for somebody new to win the Olympia next year. It's just, it's kind of a stretch at this point. So let's talk about Luke Sando coming in 11th place here. His first Olympia ever, just came off that 3rd place finish at the Arnold Classic in Columbus, Ohio, a 2nd place finish, and a really impressive call out with Dexter Jackson at the Tampa Pro just a month ago. And I actually had Luke in my top 6 here. So this was the prediction that I missed the mark the furthest on. Now, I did predict Brandon was going to win. I doubled down on that many times. I was very confident that Brandon was going to win this Olympia. When he found out Hadi was in Men's Open, I predicted he would be top 3. I believe Bonac would be in that top 3. But I think Luke is the guy that I was furthest away from actually predicting his placing. And honestly, I think Luke's a great guy. I think he's a tremendous bodybuilder. He's got a tremendous amount of size. And I think he's definitely got still a very bright future in bodybuilding. But to be honest, when I saw some of the videos of Luke leading up to the Olympia, like when he landed in Vegas, I was worried when I saw those videos, because in those videos, to me, I noticed a significant amount of distension in Luke's midsection. Now, I was just hoping this was something that was from carbing up, and this was something that would go away, by the time the day of the show came around. But to be completely honest, and I consider Luke to be a friend, and this is just a completely honest criticism, I thought that he wasn't really controlling his midsection that well on stage. And I think that was the reason for his 11th place finish. Now, obviously, I think his conditioning was a little bit off as well. But to me, watching some of the callouts, I was noticing the midsection spill out a little bit, and he was losing control of it, in a lot of those comparisons. So I think that could be really why he placed 11th. Now, I do want to talk about William Bonac here as well for a second, because William Bonac taking 2nd place here, very big deal for William. He was 3rd place. I think that was his highest placing at the Olympia in 2017. Now, this is his new highest placing at the Olympia without a coach, without working with Neil Hill. Now, whatever the drama was between them, whoever was right, whoever was wrong, he did come into this without a coach. He prepped himself and trained himself and finished the duration of his prep without a coach that he was used to having pretty much his entire professional career. So I think that really says a lot about William Bonac, and really is a pretty big deal for him to place where he placed. And I do think he looked phenomenal. I mean, I think he looked very tight. I think he looked slightly better at the Arnold Classic, where he was really, really pushing Brandon. I don't think he was pushing Brandon as hard at the Olympia as he was pushing him at the Arnold. I think it was really close at the Arnold Classic. But I think at this year's Olympia, it was a more clear win for Brandon over Bonac. And like I said, I think you could even make an argument for Hadi beating Bonac. But still, I think it's very, very impressive that Bonac was able to finish his prep without a coach, place where he did, look how he looked. I mean, he was on. And, he wasn't off. He looked very, very good. And I think, hats off to William Bonac for placing where he did. Now, another guy who really impressed the hell out of me was Steve Kuklo. Steve Kuklo, he's been grinding for a really long time at this game, and he got the first call out here. He finally got to stand next to these guys, and that's exactly what he said at the press conference, is put me next to these guys and let me get these comparisons. And they did that. They put him in the top 6. They put him in the first call out, and he got to stand next to the top guys at this year's Mr. Olympia because he looked phenomenal. And I think this is another case of, even though Steve might not have the best structure or the prettiest physique, he brings a gnarly-ass level of conditioning to the Olympia stage. He was vascular, he was hard, he looked insane from a conditioning standpoint. And I think it was that level of conditioning that got him that first call out. Like I said, I think conditioning is really, it's everything at the Olympia. When guys don't come in shape, they get dinged big time, and they place significantly lower than they would place otherwise. And when guys come in with crazy conditioning that might not have the best physiques, they place a lot higher than guys that might have better genetics or better physiques or better structures because their conditioning is so good. So my hat is definitely off to Steve Kuklo, because I think that was fantastic for him. I think that's exactly what Steve wanted. I don't think Steve was expecting to win the Olympia. I think first call out, top sixth place is exactly where Steve wanted to be. That's exactly where Steve needed to be. And I think that was a good placing for Steve Kukla. I think, again, I'm really happy for him and really proud of him. I've met Steve on a couple of occasions. I was there for both of his Indy Pro wins. I was there for his first win, and I was there for his second win. So I'm really, really happy to see him as a top 6 Olympian now. I think he definitely deserved it. Now, I also wanted to address kind of the elephant in the room. Primarily, I run a YouTube channel about bodybuilding. I post a lot of Olympia videos. The comment that I have been seeing the most is that this is the quote-unquote most boring Olympia in history, or the least competitive Olympia in history. People were saying they just turned off the live stream because they didn't care. I saw this comment many, many times. Do I believe this was the most boring Olympia ever? Actually, I don't. I do think it was exciting to see a brand new champion crowned. I think it was highly competitive for that reason. I think we got the opportunity to see some guys really shine and really get their physiques in a really good call out and get out in the spotlight that otherwise wouldn't be in the spotlight. So for that reason, I thought it was an entertaining Olympia, and I was honored to be there, and I was happy to go. Now, that being said, as far as viewership and the audience, I did see the comment a lot that people just quit watching the live stream. And honestly, in the audience, I did take a video of this, but I'm not going to post it, but there was a lot of empty seats in the audience, like well into the show, like 2.5 hours into the show. There were like entire sections of the arena that were noticeably empty. So even though I don't think it was the most boring Olympia ever, I think, maybe the fan perception of it was, and a lot of people just really weren't interested in this year's Mr. Olympia. And that was also reflected on the views. Last year, I had a video recap of the 2018 Olympia, Phil versus Sean, that got like 4 million views. I think my highest viewed video from this Olympia weekend was about 300,000. So to be honest with you guys, from a number standpoint, I for one have noticed a lack of interest in this year's Mr. Olympia. It's certainly something I can't deny. The videos from last year's Olympia, and I didn't even go to last year's Olympia, were significantly higher in views than the videos that I did this year. And again, the audience actual physical attendance didn't really seem to be that high. And I don't think that's any fault of the promoters or the people behind the Olympia. I think it has a lot to do with the fact that the big names weren't there, and circumstances that were outside of the control of the Mr. Olympia and of AMI. Sean Roden, Phil Heath, Big Ramy. I think these are things that really were just outside of the control, but really did hurt the competition. And honestly, I think the highlight of the show, was seeing Brandon win. I think it was a very feel-good moment. It was cool to see. And again, I want to thank every single person that came out this weekend to see me at my booth at the expo. I really appreciate each and every single fan that came up to me and just introduced themselves or took a picture. It was a really humbling experience. I want to thank Sean Roden for stopping by my booth, giving me an interview, and taking the opportunity to meet fans at my booth. It was a tremendous honor to have Sean there. He is the reigning 2018 Mr. Olympia after all. All circumstances aside, innocent until proven guilty, he is Mr. Olympia. And I was honored that he wanted to appear at my booth. I want to thank Dan Solomon, who ran the Olympia, for having me out there, and making it a great weekend for me. And I don't think the Olympia is dead or boring or dying. I think next year, is probably going to be more exciting. I think we're going to have Big Ramy there. I think Big Ramy is going to qualify for next year's Olympia. There's the potential of Sean Roden being able to compete, assuming he is eventually cleared of these charges. And I think there really is a lot to look forward to. So that is my recap of the 2019 Mr. Olympia. Please give it a thumbs up if you enjoyed it. Please subscribe to this channel if you have not subscribed yet already. Please follow me on Instagram if you have not followed me on Instagram already, at Nick Strength Power. And as always, thank you guys for watching. Nick Strength and Power, signing out.